Between 1941 and 1945, in the heart of the Reich, a system was built where architecture, logistics, and administration were placed at the service of the death. No was a chain of neither spontaneous murders nor a succession of disorderly crimes. It was a machine designed, built, and perfected to exterminate human beings without pause, without noise, without a trace. The plans were drawn up with precision, the structures were reinforced with millimetric calculations, and the procedures were executed with almost mechanical coldness. Everything had a purpose, from the underground chambers to the ventilation ducts, from the landing ramps to the openings through which the gas was introduced. As the smoke rose, the registers were filled, the shifts were fulfilled, and the bodies disappeared in timed cycles. Nothing was left to chance. Death became routine, and behind of each past, of each every decision, every technical improvement was made by human hands, who built, supervised, and kept the machinery running. This story shows how it was possible, without judgment or metaphor, just with facts, fragments, and remnants. Architecture of the extermination, design and function of the crematoria. At the end of 1941, the Auschwitz camp's construction office, known as the Bauleitung, began receiving specific orders related to the expansion of the extermination facilities. The first steps were taken with the creation of plans for new buildings that, unlike the improvised bunkers used until then, would be designed from the outset to facilitate the mass murder of people. It was in this context that sketches for the future crematoria 2 and 3 appeared, structures that would have basements, undressing rooms, gas chambers, and crematory ovens, all organized underground. Connected. The role of Bauleitung was essential because it not only coordinated the physical construction, but also managed the contracts with civil companies such as Topf and Sons, which were responsible for the design and supply of the furnaces. The construction project of these crematoriums was approved in January of 1942, and from that moment on, internal documents began to circulate detailing every part of the process. One of the most striking elements of these documents is the way they avoid any direct mention of the building's true purpose. Instead of referring to murders or executions, the plans use terms like Leichenkeller, which literally means cellar for corpses, but in this case referred to the gas chambers. This deliberate use of technical, neutral, and administrative language served to conceal the building's true function, even from those workers or technicians who were unaware of the entire operation. Crematorium 2 was the first to be completed. It was built in Birkenau, south of the main camp, and had a reinforced brick structure, with cement, with a part major at ground level containing the ovens, and 2 underground cellars, one for the undressing of the victims and another that functioned as a gas chamber. People were taken up a ramp to the cellar, where they had to remove their clothes. They were then led by an aisle toward the other basement, where were installed the showers false and where, after closing the airtight doors, Cyclone B gas was introduced from the outside through special openings in the roof. In the furnace room of Crematorium 2, 5 triple incineration units were installed, designed by the firm Topf and Sons, allowing up to 15 corpses to be burned at the same time. These furnaces were connected to a great chimney central through a system of ducts that guaranteed the continuous exit of smoke. The company designer had optimized the combustion time so that each cycle out it further short possible, and the plans show a constant concern to increase the processing rate. In addition, a freight elevator was added between the basement and the furnace room to speed up the transfer of bodies from the gas chamber to the furnaces. Crematorium 3 was built bit after with a design almost identical, located in the opposite side of the camp. Both buildings operated simultaneously and in a coordinated manner, allowing for a pace of extermination unprecedented until that time. The precision, the drawing technique impresses with its clarity. Every measurement, every ventilation, every safety closure is noted in detail. These were not improvised structures, but installations planned from the ground up. He start for a function concrete, with calculations of capacity and performance. During the inspection of the machinery in the summer of 1942, Topf and Söhne engineers traveled to Auschwitz to oversee the final assembly of the ovens. Surviving documents include technical reports, shipping orders, and service notes describing how they were to be lit, maintained, and adjusted. The ovens were designed to ensure efficient cremation. The procedures for lighting the ovens without additional fuel, using the victim's body fat as an energy source, are even detailed. These instructions do not appear in public documents, but were mentioned in later statements by some technicians who participated in the process. Another relevant aspect is the evolution of concealment methods. Initially, the bodies were buried in mass graves, but sanitary and contamination problems soon arose. Water underground. By that, he prioritized the cremation as a standard method of disposal. Crematoria, be built lowland and located away from transit areas, they offered greater discretion. Visual walls and screens were installed to prevent prisoners or casual visitors from seeing what was happening. The chimneys, visible from much of the countryside, were camouflaged with additional structures and trees planted around the perimeter. The plans also show the location of the deposits of ashes, some of they hidden behind of walls, fake, or buried near the river. The ashes were collected and, in many cases, used to cover roads or emptied into the water, which eliminated any physical trace. The planning left no loose ends. Every element was designed to facilitate the extermination and at the same time conceal it. Even the ventilation ducts of the chamber's gas were designed for allow the entrance of air. Once the operation was completed, they accelerated the cleaning process and prepared the room for the next arrival. The technical documentation preserved in the archives also shows the involvement of multiple departments in the development of the crematoria. The Bauleitung coordinated with the SS, with companies' civilians, and with the laboratories of rehearsal that they tested the endurance of the materials used. Letter exchanges between offices show how details such as thickness of the walls, guy of brick refractory, and the placement of the gas grills. There is no indication that those responsible felt remorse or doubt about the use of our facilities, but that all HE drove as a project construction, with delivery times, budgets, and technical reviews. These structures were not improvised or the product of an emergency. They were the result of months of planning, work set between technicians, engineers, and administrators, all aware that they were building a facility whose sole purpose was to eliminate human beings as quickly and discreetly as possible. What began as a series of ideas on paper eventually became a carefully assembled, maintained, and perfected machine of death to fulfill its function without interruption. The cameras of gas attached. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, after the creation of the Birkenau camp, several primitive facilities were quickly built to respond to the extermination plan underway. In a wooded area north of 2 repurposed agricultural buildings were built from the complex as cameras of gas. These facilities, known as Bunker 1 and Bunker 2, were adapted to their new function in just a few weeks, without complex industrial infrastructure or sophisticated technical devices. They were simple rural buildings, with thick walls, sloping roofs, and small sealed windows, designed solely to serve their purpose discreetly and quickly. The transformation included dividing the interiors into several rooms, reinforcing ventilation, installing airtight doors, and opening holes in the roof to allow gas to enter. Each of these structures could accommodate hundreds of people at a time. The method used was the same as in Chelmno. The deportees entered under deception. They closed the doors, and then he threw his Zyklon B through the openings, while the operators remained out watching the times. After the process, the rooms were aired and the Sonderkommandos removed the bodies, which were buried in open graves in a nearby area. These buildings, the annexes, served as a temporary solution until the completion of the new cremation facilities. Bunker 1 began operating in the spring of 1942, continued some months then, through Bunker 2. Although the two operated in parallel, their structure and location were different. The first was surrounded by trees and rural roads. The second was closer to the center of the camp and had a more defined internal organization. In both cases, the objective was the same: to allow mass elimination without delay, without industrial resources, and without visible records. There were no control panels or specialized technicians, only guards, gas managers, and prisoners, assigned to withdraw the corpses. To way of his rusticity, our cameras were used for several months in a continues. When the new cremation facilities were not yet ready, these bunkers they converted in axis of the system Birkenau extermination camp. During this period, large-scale murders were recorded, especially of Jews coming from the High Silesia. of regions busy of the this and from the Theresienstadt ghetto. The figures were never officially recorded, but testimonies agree that thousands of victims per week were reported during the most intense months. The logistics he supported in the use of trucks for move the bodies toward the graves, that then were covers with lime and earth. At the end of 1942, with the increase in bodies, opted for open-air burning. Makeshift grills were built from railroad tracks over dug trenches, where the bodies were piled on top of each other, doused with fuel and lit. Smoke was constant, his smell persistent, and the surroundings of the forest were soaked for days. To avoid information leaks, the perimeter was fenced with barbed wire, movement was restricted, and absolute silence was ordered. The prisoners assigned to these tasks lived isolated, without contact with other sectors of the camp. From time to time, they were eliminated and replaced by new groups to prevent any testimony from spreading. The decision to build these annex chambers arose of an order, centralized written, but from the need to continue the extermination without interruption while the larger-scale constructions were completed. It was a compromise between improvisation overall and technical organization. Despite their provisional nature, they operated stably for several months, and their structure was maintained even after the larger crematoria came into operation. This HEI had to that, in moments of great volume arrivals, the main chambers were enough, and the bunkers were reactivated as support. In several occasions between 1943 and 1944, especially during the mass deportations from Hungary, Bunker 2 was position of new in operation. For so already there was improved his around. Higher fences were installed, the interiors were painted, and benches were added to make victims believe it was simply a waiting room or a restroom. Outside, plants and signs with reassuring words were placed, while lines were organized by gender and age. The operation was controlled by camp personnel, with the forced collaboration of the prisoners assigned. In each cycle, he continued his same procedure, with no room for interruptions or appeals. The gas was released from the roof, the closure was total, and I expected between 15 and 20 minutes for ventilate. Afterwards, the doors were opened, cleaning began, and the place was prepared for the next group. No, there was schedules fixed, neither shifts defined. All adjusted to the rhythm of the trains and to the number of people arriving. If a transport brought too many deportees and the crematoria couldn't cope, the bunkers were activated as reinforcements. Although they never had the same capacity as the central facilities, they played a key role in keeping the system active without interruptions. When the main chambers were repaired, the bunkers took over the task with the same methods, the same products, and the same results. Even at the end in 1944, when he was preparing for dismantle part of the operation, our structures were used a time further. Some officers, they proposed destroying them to eliminate evidence, but it was not carried out of immediate. He maintained in foot until the evacuation of the camp began. Only then, in January 1945, was its partial destruction ordered. The walls were torn down, the roofs burned, and the surrounding areas razed to the ground. Even so, several remains were left visible and served as evidence during subsequent investigations. Original plans, survivor testimonies, and aerial photographs made it possible to reconstruct their exact location, size, and function. Although rudimentary, these annexed chambers represented a key phase of extermination, a stage in which the machinery still It was industrial, but it had already acquired the systematic form that defined the process. However, need for advanced technology, they managed to implement a method of mass murder that responded to the demands of speed, concealment, and efficiency. The ability industrial of the extermination. During 1942, camp officials sought to develop a solution that would allow them to destroy a large number of bodies in the shortest possible time. Instead of using improvised open-air methods, such as mass graves or wooden pyres, they began to consider building more efficient permanent facilities. The model, that term imposing itself, was of the industrial crematoriums, capable of disposing of thousands of bodies a day without interrupting the pace of extermination. The idea did not start from scratch, but was based on previous experiences with urban cremation adapted to the particular conditions of the countryside. The project was developed under the direction of the Topf und Söhne Company, which already had experience in the construction of furnaces for civilian crematoria, but was called upon to design completely new equipment for an unprecedented scale of operation. The calculations made in the technical plans considered not only the number of furnaces required, but also the amount of bodies that they should to introduce oneself by shift, the time that took each cremation, and the Gaia fuel available. The model further used was the 3-retort furnace, where 3 bodies could be burned simultaneously in a single chamber, saving resources and speeding up the process. In some cases, more bodies were added sequentially, taking advantage of the residual heat to continue feeding the flame. Engineers documented the thermal performance and established routines to maintain continuous operation for several hours at a time. According to technical reports, each furnace could operate uninterruptedly for more than 12 hours, with cremation times as low as 20 minutes per body, depending on the physical condition of the corpse. The facilities also included forced ventilation systems, gas evacuation mechanisms, and protective structures. Burden that allowed introduce the bodies with faster. To feed the furnaces, coke, a type of coal of high energy, which was stored in tanks near each crematorium. Fuel consumption was controlled, and operators learned to regulate the tickets of air for maintain a constant temperature. The documents mention that the chambers could reach temperatures superiors to the 1,000 degrees, that allowed the reduction complete from the body to ashes in a few minutes. As for the building's design, each crematorium was divided into several sections: an antechamber, a waiting room, the gas chamber, and the furnace room. Some facilities also included a basement or a ramp for easy transport of bodies from the chambers to the cremation room. The walls were reinforced and covered with heat and acid-resistant materials, as the combustion process released liquids and gases that could damage the structures if left unchecked. In some cases, the roofs had special openings through which the lethal gas was released before incineration. Planning also included calculating the total number of bodies that could be transported, be eliminated in one day. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, the set of the crematoriums 2, 3, 4, and 5 were designed to reach a daily capacity of up to 4,500 people. This calculation was not theoretical, but based on actual tests carried out by SS operators and documented by engineers. The objective was to ensure that the disposal machinery was never overwhelmed by the arrival of new transports, and that the bodies did not accumulate. When this occurred, as at certain times in 1944, he resorted to graves to the air free to supplement the work of the kilns, using firewood and human fat as additional fuel. Testimonies collected after the war agree that the process was carried out with almost mechanical precision. The Sonderkommando managers received specific instructions to each phase, from the emptying of the cameras until the cleaning of the ovens. Rotating shifts and internal rules were established for drive the remains, separate the ashes, and remove the unburned bones. The ashes were crushed, mixed with earth, and thrown into the river or scattered in fields close. In the records were kept of the batches burned, and fuel usage was monitored. Inspections were frequent, and any delays had to be explained. The technical documents also show how efforts were being made to improve performance. One of the top company's letters proposed using more powerful fans to reduce combustion time. Other reports suggested using mobile grills to allow for better heat distribution. The idea was to make crematoriums a continuous chain of destruction, with the body entering and, minutes later, emerging reduced to ashes. This industrial logic marked a key difference from other methods of murder massive use in history. Here it was not just about killing, but about erasing all traces of the corpse in the shortest possible time. Time possible, as part of a system organized and timed. At the administrative level, crematoria were considered an essential part of the extermination apparatus. The plans were approved by high-ranking officials. Controls, the materials were transported with priority, and technicians received direct orders from Berlin. Detailed memorandums were drawn up on the progress of the works, and improvements were discussed as if it were a factory in expansion. Even he thought in enlarge the ability building new ovens or reusing damaged parts of old ones. The destruction I had to continue without pause. The machinery could not be stopped, and this required impeccable logistics, from the arrival of the gas to the evacuation of ashes. As the Eastern Front approached, some furnaces were dismantled and their parts buried or destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Despite these attempts to erase the traces, enough physical remains, technical documents, and testimonies remained to reconstruct the entire functioning of the system. The structures of the crematoria, ovens, chimneys, coke tanks, ramps, and chambers were analyzed with detail by the researchers after of the war. Thanks to this, it was possible to calculate their real capacity and confirm that they were designed to function as systematic elimination centers. The precision of the plans and the correspondence between technicians and engineers leaves no doubt that the objective was to maintain a constant rate of extermination with a minor use possible of resources, reducing timeouts and maximizing the result. The paper of the HH. Within the camp structure, the SS had complete control over every aspect of its operation. Administration, surveillance, forced labor, and extermination were under their command. A few officers were responsible for general logistics, while many others were entrusted with more specific tasks such as supervise prisoners, order selections, or coordinate transportation. Shape. The way the SS ran the crematoria was seamlessly integrated into the overall extermination system. Each facility operated with a combination of technical staff and special commandos made up of detainees, but always under the direct supervision of an officer. From the outset of operations, it was determined that no major process could be carried out without the approval of the HH. They controlled the accesses, the time, decisions, and quantities. Every order passed by an official, and none action chi toward without their knowledge. This ensured that nothing escaped their control. If something went wrong, consequences fell on subordinates, not superiors. The SS members responsible for the crematorium sector received precise instructions and were required to follow them rigorously. They had to ensure that everything went according to plan, that deadlines were respected, and that the results were as expected. Efficiency was key. If a transport arrived, it had to be processed quickly. If there was a change in the pace of extermination, they had to adapt. Each crematorium had its assigned officer, and each of them answered to their superiors. Although the Sonderkommandos were the ones who handled the bodies and activated the ovens, everything was done under the look of the HH. These participated directly in the handling, but they were present during every important phase. If the process needed to be accelerated, they decided. If something was delayed, they gave the order to fix it. In practice, they were the ones who started and ended each day of death. In addition to operational control, the SS also had the task of maintaining order. This meant being alert to any sign of resistance or disobedience among the prisoners. In particular, they kept watch to the Sonderkommandos. Already that they knew details of the inner workings that the rest of the detainees did not know. Any suspicion of contact with other groups, attempted escape, or leaking information was punishable by death. Officers organized frequent inspections, interrogated the prisoners, and constantly inspected the workspaces. They left no room for doubt. A member of the Sonderkommando committed a mistake, was replaced of immediate. Every so often the teams were completely renewed, executing those who had been there the longest, to avoid links between them or possible plans for rebellion. This brutal rotation was part of the routine. The relationship between the SS officers and the technical staff was also crucial. For the ovens to function as expected, a high level of coordination narrow with the engineers and builders. Companies external, as Topf and Sons, had sent workers to the field to assemble the ovens and install the ventilation and extraction systems. Although they were civilians, his presence was regulated by the HH. None worker could move without authorization, and each intervention was documented and controlled by an officer. In the information inmates, the engineers they pointed out that during the evidence there was always an SS officer observing. This ensured that any data, anomalies, or technical recommendations were immediately reported. If the furnaces did not meet the expected performance, the officers demanded explanations and improvements. The pressure was constant. Another key aspect was the officers' direct responsibility for meeting quotas. Although shipments arrived from different regions, it was the commanding officer's obligation to process them within a limited time. To achieve this, they used several cameras at the same time, or the days of activity were extended until nighttime. When this happened, multiplied the presence of the HH around of the crematoriums, not only to guarantee that all even his course, but also for avoid that he exhaustion or he disorder interfered. The toughest decisions were made at those times. If a camera number could receive further people, he official I had to decide to who he maintained waiting, who were transferred to another sector, or if was necessary eliminate before to the of the day before to free up space. All of this happened in a matter of hours, with no room for error. Often the officers were also responsible for subsequent reports. Each activity relevant was registered. It is, they scored the dates, the schedules, the number of people processed, and the operating conditions of the equipment. Although some data was hidden or coded to prevent leaks, everything was recorded in internal documents. Some of these reports survived the end of the war and allowed part of the operations to be reconstructed. In them, we can see how the officers evaluated the effectiveness of the crematoria, proposed adjustments, or reported technical failures. This documentation shows that these were not improvisations, but rather a machine that was planned, adjusted, and controlled step by step. There was also a psychological component to the behavior of the SS. Although they avoided directly involving themselves in the most brutal tasks, their mere presence was enough to keep the tension. His way of speaking, ordering, looking, or punishing created a climate where he feared it worked as tool of control. No needed hit or shoot constantly, all it took was an order. They knew that if someone didn't obey, there was no need to repeat it. The punishment was immediate. That silent, almost automatic, gave them a feeling of absolute control over what was happening inside of the field. In the crematoria, this attitude was even more evident. They came in, observed, gave instructions, and they left. They didn't argue, they didn't flinch. For them, it was all part of a job. Over time, some officers came to see their role as just another task within the Reich apparatus. Some even requested transfers for personal reasons or asked for recognition for their performance. Their letters, applications, and administrative files show that they viewed their role as part of a career. Considered criminals, but rather officials fulfilling an obligation. This bureaucratic coldness was one of the elements that allowed the system to continue for so long without interruption. The SS then not only participated in the extermination, they were the ones who organized, coordinated, and supervised it. Their role was not secondary. They were at the center of everything. From the largest decisions to the smallest details, nothing escaped their control. Every chamber, every oven, every transport, every list, every execution had the figure of an officer behind it. Without them, nothing would have been possible. And with them, everything was carried out with an efficiency that is still difficult to understand today. The Sonderkommando. The men of the Sonderkommando were not chosen of their own free will. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, some prisoners, especially the strongest or most resilient, were separated without explanation. Shortly afterward, they discovered that their destiny would be to work at the heart of the extermination system. Their tasks consisted of operating the crematoria, assisting in the gas chambers, and eliminating all traces of the victims. They were forced witnesses to mass murder, trapped in a cycle of death from which they could neither escape nor speak. The members of the Sonderkommando were held in barracks separate from the rest of the camp, under constant surveillance and with restricted access to the outside. They had an imposed and rigid routine. In the morning, they were led away, to the crematoriums, where they should waiting for the trains to arrive. When the cars stopped and the doors opened, they watched as hundreds of people got off. Deception was always present. The new arrivals were told they were going to shower, that they should leave their belongings in order and memorize the exact place where they left them to retrieve them later. Some believed it, others were suspicious, but no one could escape. The Sonderkommando had to remain on the sidelines without intervening. When the victims were locked in the chambers and the doors were closed, one of the HH threw her gas. From outside, the Sonderkommando prisoners heard the screams, the blows, the final silence. Only then could they open the doors and begin his job. It first was withdraw the bodies. The gas left their skins scarred, their faces deformed, their limbs intertwined in despair. Separating them required strength and speed. Time was limited, and orders were strict. Then the transfer to the furnaces began. Sometimes, if the furnaces couldn't hold so many bodies, open-air pits were used. There, the bodies were stacked such as logs and doused with fuel. The Sonderkommando was to move them, light the fire, and maintain it. When the remains were left reduced to ashes, he following past was to sift the dust to recover valuables. Gold teeth, rings, or earrings were removed and handed over. Every inch of the bodies was inspected. Nothing was left behind. The process had to proceed without delay. The SS controlled every movement. Any sign of weakness, doubt, or refusal could result in immediate execution. Despite being in direct contact with death, the men of the Sonderkommando were treated with a mixture of utility and contempt. They were not allowed to speak about what they saw. They were not allowed to tell what that they knew. They lived with the certainty of that, late, either early. Also, they would be killed to eliminate witnesses. The shifts were long, sometimes day and night, without a break. The smell of burning bodies impregnated the clothes, hair, the fur. Smoke, it covered all. Noise of the ovens did not stop. When they arrived new trains, process he repeated. No, there was pause. Some members tried to maintain a certain humanity. When they could, they approached the victims before the gas, pretending to help them get into position, offering gentle words or signs of sympathy. But these gestures were minimal. Any act of endurance meant immediate death. In certain cases, the Sonderkommando attempted to leave evidence. They hid writings, photographs, and objects inside the crematoriums. They knew that his time was limited, and they wanted someone to know what was happening. Several managed to hide manuscripts in bottles or bury them near of the facilities. Some were found after the war. In them, they accurately described what they did, what they saw, what they suffered. They didn't ask for compassion, only the truth. Contact with the SS was constant, but limited to orders. There was no dialogue. The guards avoided any close contact. Many considered the members of the Sonderkommando to be dead in the cold life. To times, new prisoners were recruited to replace the previous ones, who were systematically killed in groups every few months. The cycle repeated itself. No one came out alive. Only a few managed to survive, go into hiding, or be released at the end of the conflict. Within the Sonderkommando, there were specific functions. Some were in charge only of moving bodies, others operated the ovens or watched the fire. There were those in charge of cutting women's hair before gas, since hair also was collected for other purposes. Everything was regulated, recorded, and counted. The death industry required precision, efficiency, and compliance, and the Sonderkommando was a key element. The survivors' later accounts echo the brutality of the work, not only because of the physical effort, but also because of the trauma. Many claimed to have acted like automatons, without thought, without emotion, simply performing it tidy for continue breathing another day. Some claimed to have lost track of time. Others remembered every face, every voice, every look of those who knew they were going to die. The Sonderkommando was also part of an attempted rebellion. In October 1944, a group organized an uprising inside Auschwitz. They managed to blow up part of Crematorium 4 using explosives provided by women of internal resistance. Several members of the group were captured and executed, but the action was recorded as an act of desperation and courage. They didn't expect to escape, only to resist, to leave a mark. The existence of the Sonderkommando is one of the darkest aspects of the functioning of the group. Of Auschwitz, their role was essential to the extermination system, but their story was silenced for a long time. Many survivors of the Holocaust avoided talk of them. Some considered them accomplices. Others didn't know how to understand their experience. Over the years, documents, testimonies, and archives have made it possible to reconstruct part of what these men experienced. They were victims caught in cogs in the death machine, forced to collaborate to survive, bearing the weight of what they saw. The process of extermination. When the trains they stopped, the carriages opened abruptly. In most cases, no one explained what was happening. All you could hear were shouts, barking dogs, and orders shouted by the soldiers. The new arrivals were quickly ushered out, leaving behind luggage, blankets, or whatever little they had with them. They formed separate lines, men on one side, women and children on the other. From that instant, many families were separated forever without knowing it. The selection was immediate. One or two officers they pointed out with the hand. Some were going to the right, others to the left. There were no explanations. The elderly, the sick, mothers with you drink, and children, little ones, were separated. Most of them didn't last more than a few hours alive. The further strong, those with appearance of can work, he directed them to another section of the camp. Those about to die were guided toward the gas chambers, but before that they were made to wait in closed areas. They were told they were going to shower, that it was a disinfection procedure. To make it seem true, they were asked to leave their clothes and shoes in order, placed in row. To times even were hanging towel racks, either posters with instructions. Everything was designed to prevent panic scenes from breaking out. They entered naked, in groups, into a room that looked like a communal bathroom. The ceiling was low, the walls were cement. Some rooms had fake showers or grates in the floor. In her ceiling there were small openings closed with tapas of iron. Once the door was hermetically sealed from the outside, the prisoners were trapped. Those in charge of gassing, usually members of the Sonderkommando, received the signal. They climbed an outside ladder or a concrete structure and opened the trap doors. They released crystals of Zyklon B, a product previously used as an insecticide. This dissolved in heat and released a lethal gas. Few minutes, those inside began to suffocate. The process could last between 15 and 30 minutes, depending on the number of people and the conditions inside the chamber. From outside, some heard the banging on the walls, the screams, the sound of nails against cement. Then, silence. Only then was the door opened. The bodies were piled up, intertwined with expressions of anguish, signs of a struggle. The Sonderkommando members had to remove the bodies, remove teeth of gold, cutting hair if necessary. It was a task repeated every day without rest. Afterwards, the bodies were transported to the crematory ovens. Each of these could operate around the clock. According to the data documented by Hilberg and corroborated by Levi, each oven could incinerate several hundreds of bodies in a only day. Open-air graves were also used when capacity was insufficient. The corpses were doused with fuel and burned directly. The remains were crushed. Bones that did not disintegrate were ground in special machines. The ashes were scattered in rivers, fields, or buried. No was left trail. The entire procedure was systematized. Each person had a role. Every step was planned. From the moment a train arrived until the wreckage was removed, only a few hours passed. Documents, records, and testimonies agree that this process could be repeated several times a day. Schedules were adjusted, the organization was optimized. There was no improvisation, it was a mechanism constant. The death he converted in a task repetitive. The managers of to carry it out, no showed reaction, was his job. No he was trying of individual madness, but rather a functional, organized structure based on assigned tasks. Primo Levi clearly described the confusion initial of the deported. Nobody understood what was happening. The newcomers looked around, searching for clues, but there were no obvious signs. Everything was fast, cold, without eye contact, without answers. Silence mixed with screams. The speed with which everything happened made it impossible to process what was happening. Those who survived a few more days began to understand what had happened when it was already too late. Hilberg, for his part, documented each stage as part of an administrative system. It was not necessary give orders oral. There was forms, schedules, records. The trains arrived with their load. The number of people was recorded. The number was noted of dead. Valuables were stored there, shoes, clothes, glasses, all he sorted. Even the hair was stored in sacks. It was an economy of extermination. The process had no breaks. Even when there were no trains, the ovens kept working. Sometimes bodies were brought in from other areas, or the camp hospitals were emptied. No one was safe. The danger didn't come only from outside. It could come from an internal order, a shift change, a new roster. A rumor was enough to renew fear. The members of the Sonderkommando were Jewish prisoners. They knew their time was limited. Each true time were executed and replaced. No heathen allowed go out. No, they were given rest. They ate apart. They were sleeping in sectors isolated. Only could talk among them. Some left hidden testimonies, handwritten, buried in jars or cans. They knew their word would be one of the few pieces of evidence. The machinery of extermination worked non-stop. The arrival of the deportees, the selection, gassing, the elimination of the bodies, all was thought for, that no, there were interruptions. If any element failed, he replaced it immediately. The trains. They kept arriving. Each one brought more people, more names, more lives that would never leave again. For those inside, each new convoy heralded more work. For those arriving, it was the end without knowing it. The precision with which everything was executed didn't respond to military logic. There were no strategic objectives. This wasn't a conventional war, it was something else. It was a process created exclusively to finish off people. Bullets weren't used, armies weren't needed. Trains, smoke, and silence were enough. The smoke rising from the chimneys brought no questions. The ash falling on the fields prompted no answers. Everything remained the same day after day. Those who saw it and survived could never forget, not because of the images, but because of the rhythm, because of the way extermination became part of the day, because of how death stopped being something distant, because of how one learned to walk among mountains of shoes, piles of bodies, flying ashes, because the pain didn't come in a single blow but in fragments, repeated daily. The disappearance of evidence. From the very first moments the extermination camps were operational, some Nazi officials were already concerned about concealing what they were doing. However, it was only when the Allied military advance became irreversible that the Reich authorities ordered the systematic erasure of all traces of the extermination operation. This campaign of concealment included the destruction of buildings, documents, tools, technical installations, and any element that could serve as evidence of the mass murder that had taken place there. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the process of eliminating evidence began with the crematoria. Between the summer of 1944 and January 1945, the partial dismantling or complete of the cameras gas and the crematoriums. In the ovens 2 and 3, sealing of the cameras of gas underground was blown up. The bodies of the kilns were dismantled and the interior structures burned. In the kilns 4 and 5, he destroyed roofs and walls, he dispersed bricks and debris, and technical records were burned. The objective was clear: to prevent the Soviets, already very close, from finding material evidence of the murders. A significant part of this effort focused on the Sonderkommando. These groups of prisoners, forced to participate in the extermination process, were systematically eliminated. To finish his use, but also in the final stages, they were forced to destroy the remains of their own activities. Some were forced to dig ditches, bury bones, scatter ashes, or dismantle facilities. When they were no longer needed, they were executed. This elimination was also part of the plan to erase witnesses, uncomfortable. Beyond the physical structures, the Nazis also sought to eliminate all documentary evidence of the genocide. In many camps, records were burned, intake forms destroyed, facility plans removed, and all written communication disposed of. Construction documents, technical correspondence with supplier companies, transportation spreadsheets, meeting minutes, and internal reports were destroyed. Although some copies survived elsewhere, most were destroyed in the weeks before the collapse of the Reich. These measures were also applied in other places where extermination camps operated, such as Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec. In these sites, the buildings were demolished, the land was leveled, and planted trees either crops on for disguise any trace. In Treblinka, for example, the camp was converted in a farm. In Sobibor, he built a home for a Ukrainian guard using remains from the camp. In all cases, the priority was to prevent the enemy from being able to reveal to the world what had happened there once the war was over. The commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, acknowledged after the war that received explicit orders to destroy the crematoria. In their memoirs, let constancy of the concern was expressed about preventing the discovery of the system of mass murder. This directive came from Berlin, directly from high-ranking SS commanders, and was urgently implemented as the end drew near. Hilberg documented how, even before the total collapse, attempts were made to close accounts, destroy evidence, erase names, and cover the entire extermination process under a layer of ashes and silence. This logic was also applied on the railway routes. Many wagons used for the deportations were returned to their origin, others were dismantled. Companies that had collaborated with the supply of materials and equipment, such as Topf and Sons, attempted to eliminate compromising records or deny their involvement. Plans, purchase orders, and parts catalogues were destroyed, and the engineers involved were dispersed. Civilian collaboration in this effort was also something that was sought to be hidden. On a broader level, the destruction of evidence also affected internal knowledge of the process. Some officers were relocated or eliminated. Others were given new identities or false documents. Some doctors and technicians were sent to the front or placed in other units. The intention was not only physical but also symbolic, to prevent history from being reconstructed through the memories of those involved. However, not all was erased. The speed of the advance ally and he collapsed general of the Nazi administration prevented the task from being completed. Some crematoria remained partially intact. Others were found still with structures visible. In Auschwitz, despite of the destruction, they found remains clear of the cameras of gas. The presence of Zyklon B, the remains of the furnaces, the chimneys damaged, and the deposit's underground tunnels allowed a detailed reconstruction of how the system had operated. Jean-Claude Pressac spent years studying these remains. Thanks to his training technique, the documents that managed to survive were able to demonstrate the operation of the crematoria, modifications made to the structures, the amount of bodies that could be incinerated per day, efficiency calculations, the use of forced ventilation, and the gas supply. Through reconstructed plans, aerial photos, reports from collaborating companies, and partial testimonies, he was able to shed light on what others had tried to hide. Thousands of human remains were also found. In some places, the ovens were dismantled, but the mass graves remained. In other cases, the earth retained traces of chemicals from the ashes. At sites such as Belzec, subsequent studies showed the presence of mountains of bones crushed mixed with land. In Treblinka, trenches filled with human remains and remains of metal structures were found. These elements, impossible to completely erase, formed the basis of the subsequent investigation. Hilberg insisted that the Nazi bureaucracy was not as efficient as previously thought. In his analysis, the state structure was so complex that much evidence survived simply because it was impossible to destroy everything in time. Furthermore, the enormous number of people involved, from guards to secretaries, generated leaks, copies, and infiltrations. Thanks to this, a considerable part of the technical and administrative functioning of the extermination is preserved today. The attempt to erase history was in itself proof of guilt. The urgency, the planning, the resources used, the violence against witnesses, and the systematic cover-up showed that these were not spontaneous or uncontrolled crimes, but a centralized operation, documented and then hidden by those who carried it out. Although the Nazis tried to cover it up all, testimony of the survivors, the scattered documents and material ruins spoke for themselves. The story, though incomplete, was reconstructed among the rubble, bones, burned papers, and broken bricks. The use of graves common. At many points during the extermination process, the crematoria were unable to absorb the number of bodies generated by the killing machine. When this happened, the Nazi authorities resorted to a method alternative, the graves common. These gaps in land became one of the most used resources during peak killings, especially in the first months of operation of the extermination centers and in circumstances where the infrastructure of the ovens was overwhelmed by the speed of mass murder. In the early days of Auschwitz-Birkenau, before the crematoria were fully operational, the fate of the corpses was almost always the same: large trenches dug near of the bunkers of gas improvised. According to explained a member of the Sonderkommando, the corpses were thrown on top of each other in orderly rows and then covered with a layer of firewood and doused with gasoline. A time that he lit up the fire, the bodies began to consume slowly. The flames and smoke would rise for days. The stench could be felt from afar. In some testimonies, he describes as workers had to remove the partially burned remains with long tools to allow the fire to spread. Gideon Greif, in his research on the Sonderkommando survivors, documented how the scale of the murders forced to improvise constantly. One of the witnesses explained that during the summer of 1944, when they began to arrive trains packed with Hungarian Jews, the crematoria could no longer cope. It was then when the use of trenches was resumed. These were not simple pits. They were organized structures, with a system of channels for drainage of the fat human that melted with the heat. That fat was collected in buckets and used as fuel additional. The members of the Sonderkommando knew exactly what to do: stack the bodies, light them, stir them, and refuel the flames. It was a non-stop, almost mechanical operation. Hilberg also mentions that faced with time pressure and the need to maintain the constant flow of extermination, the SS devised methods to speed up the process. In camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, the use of mass graves was usual even when cremation facilities already existed. In these places, the earth was removed with mechanical shovels to open gigantic graves. The corpses were pushed from the wagons directly into the ground. There, once killed in the chambers, they were taken in wheelbarrows or dragged by prisoners to the pits. On many occasions, the bodies would pile up for days without being buried or cremated. The decision to use mass graves wasn't just logistical, it was also strategic. In the early months, it wasn't clear to the Nazis that they would need to hide the traces of their crimes. So at sites like Belzec, tens of thousands of bodies were buried without concern for the consequences. But when reports began to come in about the state of these graves, bloated bodies, accumulated gas, oozing fluids, they were decomposition seeping into the ground, its exhumation and subsequent incineration were ordered. The initial use of the trenches later became a problem to be solved. One of the members of the Sonderkommando recounted how, walking near of the ditches, the ground seemed to move with gases and decomposition. It was common for some corpses to float on the surface, inflated by the body's natural processes. During the spring and summer, the heat accelerated the process, generating an unbearable odor. For the prisoners forced to work in these places, there was no pause or rest. The day was divided between transporting corpses, one of the pyres, and overseeing the fire. Some were responsible for crushing the unburned bones, while others collected the ashes to deposit in smaller pits or scatter them. In the Majdanek camp, too, he appealed to graves common. In that place, the corpses were dumped in heaps in a haphazard manner. Once a pit was filled, it was covered with lime and earth, but the process was flawed. Rain washed away the lime and left the remains exposed. The same situation was repeated in Chelmno, where the pace of murders meant work was carried out non-stop and without sufficient resources. There, gas trucks left the bodies next to open ditches. Members of the Sonderkommando dug, buried, and later dug them up to burn. Mass graves were not just a solution temporary, were part of the system. When the ovens broke down, when more trains arrived than expected, when time was short, they always returned to them. Nazis, they knew that no could arrest extermination due to a technical failure. Everything had to continue, regardless of the conditions. The soil of many fields still bears the marks of those ditches, even though they were covered. Hilberg explains that the use of pits also served as an experiment. Decomposition times were measured, fire acceleration methods were studied, and mixtures of flammable materials were tested. It wasn't just about killing, but doing it efficiently. For the Nazis, corpses were a technical variable, a logistical problem that had to be solved with tools, schedules, and engineering solutions. Mass graves were one of them. In a witness account collected by Reich, he recounts how, during a stormy night, the trenches flooded. The bodies began to float and were swept away, through the water to the edges of the forest. The next morning, the prisoners were forced to collect them one by one without matter his state. Some they were wearing days dead, others were partially calcined. All I had to return to the pit, all I had to disappear. Mass graves were the brutal and direct alternative when ovens weren't enough. They were the immediate solution to the excess of deaths, the collapse of the system, the constant pace of extermination. There, in the disturbed earth, remained buried a part essential of the crime. They weren't improvised, they were part of the plan. And although they tried to erase them, their traces are still present. The smoke perpetual and the language of the Nazi cynicism. From the very first moment, prisoners descending from the carriages noticed the heavy air, a dense and persistent smell that permeated their clothes, throats, and thoughts. No one said what it was, but it didn't need to. A dense fog constantly rose from the chimneys, and many prisoners knew or eventually learned what it meant. Primo Levi described it as not just the smoke, but the way the smoke seemed to announce death naturally, as if it were part of the environment. The sky over Auschwitz was not just grey, it was a sky of ashes, and that was the backdrop for background of everyday life. According to Sonderkommando witnesses like Philip Miller, even newcomers noticed the smell, even if they didn't immediately understand its source. Some asked questions, others remained silent. The stench was constant, a mixture of burnt flesh, fat, hair, and ash, floating in the air like part of the landscape, the invisible shadow of the crime. The smoke never stopped. Day and night, the crematorium chimneys worked. When they weren't, the bodies were incinerated in the open air, in trenches dug near the ovens, or directly in the woods behind them. Birkenau, when he rhythm of the transports exceeded the incineration capacity. Gideon Greif picked up tens of testimonies who agree on the same thing. The smoke was part of the around, as the shouting, as the barking of the dogs, like the orders. No one mentioned it openly, but everyone knew. Some of the Sonderkommando confessed that even to the eat, smoke continued there. No one could escape. It entered the lungs, the memory, the consciousness. There was no rest for the living or the dead. In that environment of industrialized extermination, the most perverse thing was not only the scale, but also the language. As Hilberg shows, the killing orders did not use clear words. They didn't say kill, they spoke of solution, end, evacuation, resettlement, special treatment. Each phase of the crime had its corresponding euphemism. For Claudia Kuhns, this was not just a tactical strategy, but an integral part of Nazi bureaucratic thinking. Extermination was carried out with forms, schedules, stamps, and administrative language. The systematic use of dehumanizing technicalities allowed thousands of officials to participate in the crime without having to morally confront what they were actually doing. Primo Levi pointed out this disconnect with bitter irony. When the Germans spoke of transfer to the this, the deportees they knew that meant the death. When they heard showers, they thought of hygiene, not gas. When they heard re-educational labor, they believed they were going to be used as laborers. This deliberate ambiguity was what made the system even more cruel. It was a crime that not only killed, but did so by lying until the last second. Language didn't serve to inform, but to conceal, to mask the horror with functional words. And the most devastating was that it worked. Many prisoners got off the trains without knowing they would die within minutes. In the testimonies collected by Greif, the members of the Sonderkommando, they counted how, as they guided the new arrivals toward the chambers, they avoided speaking. Some did so out of fear, others out of compassion, others out of simple emotional exhaustion. There were times when someone asked what the smoke meant or why it smelled that way, and the response might be silence or a white lie. But the system didn't need too many explanations. The time between arrival and execution was so short that it left no room for questioning. Children were separated, the elderly taken apart, women stripped naked in a matter of minutes. There was no time to think. There was nobody that explain it what was going to happen. And yet the smoke spoke volumes. The contrast between the horror they'd experienced and the institutional normalization was also felt in the aesthetics of the surroundings. Some survivors described how the camp's gardens were well kept, with flowers and neatly trimmed grass. The administrative buildings were clean and tidy. The office that signed orders of transport had shelves, paintings, clocks. No, there was blood. No, there was shouting, only lists, schedules, maps. That distance physics and moral between the places of decision and the places of execution was intentional. As Hilberg shows, the system was designed so that each part fulfilled its function without seeing the whole. The train driver did not see the gas chamber. The counter of the budget didn't see the corpses. The crematorium architect didn't see the faces. And so thousands of people were able to participate of a genocide without assume the responsibility directly, protected by a language that turned murder into a statistic. The members of the Sonderkommando were the ones caught between both worlds. They saw the smoke, the fire, the bodies, and also they listened the orders techniques. They witnessed the brutality of murder and its transformation into routine. According to Greif, many of them ended up losing their sense of time, language, even their own identity. One of them recalled that he could not look at the sky without think that was full of human ashes. Another said that he did not eat bread without think that their hands they had touched corpses minutes before. They lived in a world where language had lost its meaning, where words were excuses and the truth was hidden behind forms. Nazi cynicism didn't just affect the perpetrators, it also affected the victims. Using technical terms to hide reality, the system denied even the right to understand what one was suffering. Many survivors, like Levi, explained that the true horror was not just dying, but not knowing why, how, or when. Being treated as a thing, as a number, as part of a logistical process, without a face or explanation. And in that context, the smoke from the crematorium became the only witness constant, a silent presence that said without words what official language refused to utter. A scene that was repeated daily. A transport arrived, the wagons opened, the prisoners got out in confusion, the air was filled with the smell of death. Orders were dry shouts in German. and smoke continued leaving of the chimneys. Nobody explained nothing. No one mentioned what was happening, but everyone knew.